I'm Jeff Kittner with the Chamber, and we are pleased to have you all here for our second of 9 legislative series programs. As you all know, we have switched from doing an in-person day at the state, which we had planned to do last week, and have pivoted to a virtual series of programs. And 2 weeks ago, we had State Comptroller Glenn Hagar, and this week we are fortunate enough to have State Representative, Texas House District 114, John Turner. And I'm going to turn the program over to Jessica Oni with Reliant to do the welcome and introduction. So Jessica, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Well, Sandy, my colleague at Reliant, asked me if I'd come and be with you and say a few words about Representative Turner. And of course, I said yes. I'm Jessica Oni. I head up government affairs for NRG, and just really came to know the Turner family a little over a decade ago when I met former Congressman Jim Turner at an event. I heard him speak, and then afterwards had the chance to visit with him. And, you know, it was one of those meetings that sticks with you when you're just in awe of somebody and just knew that he just embodied what it means to be a public servant. The way he spoke about issues, his thoughtful approach to issues, the way he spoke about bipartisanship, and then just his overall kindness, especially to someone he never met before, just really stuck with me. Then a little bit later, I got to work with the representative's sister, Susan, when she was a staffer in the Senate. And once again, just had such a commitment to public service, had a commitment to bringing people together, and just, again, that overall kindness on working on issues just stuck with me. And she called me in 2018 and said, hey, I just want to let you know my brother is going to run for office for House District 114, and I'd like you to meet him. And so, of course, I said, absolutely, I'm anxious to meet him. And, you know, got a chance to meet him before he got elected. And you know, it was the same, just someone who clear dedication to public service, very much a thoughtful approach to issues, is passionate about this state. And I'm just so glad that he got elected to a second term. And while he's not my state rep, just we're all going to be better off for Representative Turner's service to Texas. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Representative. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Jessica. That is awfully kind of you. I really appreciate those words, and you've been a great friend to our whole family, as you mentioned. And I'm glad I was able to join my dad and sister in getting to know you and work with you in Austin. And I just want to say thank you to the NDCC and to Jeff and to Ken and to everyone who's been involved with organizing this event and putting this legislative series together. It's a real privilege for me to be with you, and a whole lot of friends I have on this call. I know it's a little bit intimidating because this is a very well-informed group of people, and I'm concerned that on most things I'll talk about, many on this call will know a lot more about it than I do, but maybe that's a good thing. You can always provide some input for me and some thoughts on the subjects we discuss. So real pleasure to be with y'all and talk about the 87th session that we're starting.
Thanks so much, John. And what I'll do is I've got a series of questions that I'll ask you, but we really want this to be interactive with the group as well. So if you've got questions for Representative Turner, please post them in the chat or send them privately to me, and we'll call on you to ask those. So let's get started with a pretty general question to start, John. We're now about a month into the session. It's been an unusual session so far due to COVID-19 and some other factors. What's your sense of how things are going so far? And most importantly, how are you and your family doing?
Well, thank you. Yes, we are, we're well underway now in the session. And, by comparison to, I think maybe the last time I talked to this group, sometime, I believe it was maybe in December, we had a little bit of interaction. A lot of things have now happened. We've had the base budgets recently just released. We had the governor deliver his State of the State address and identify his emergency items. And we, now have committees appointed in both the House and the Senate. And those developments ought to be typically enough to give you a much better sense of what is ahead. I will say, though, I have to admit that I still feel like, by comparison to last session anyway, we don't quite have the major big theme for the session, maybe just yet, if there is going to be such a theme. Last session at the beginning, it was all about school finance reform right from the beginning. And then Speaker Bonin identified right off the bat that was a major priority, and it really remains so throughout the session. We don't have that signature issue yet. What we do have, though, of course, just due to the circumstances we've been in now for closing in on a year, is the COVID session. And, I always try to continue as we dive into these specific issues and specific bills that we're going to be debating, just to keep in mind the big picture here is still that we have been facing, a situation now since last March that's unprecedented. And we're closing in on, I think the last number I saw as a nation is 460,000 deaths, which, now has surpassed the total military deaths for our country in World War II in the space of less than a year. Something like 40,000 of those deaths here in Texas. I mean, it's really staggering. And the hardship that this pandemic has wrought, across all segments of society is really something that, it's still difficult, I think, for us all to get our minds around. And the challenges that has created for our school system and for our health infrastructure, and the economic hardships faced by so many, and the small businesses that are hurt. I mean, you all know it better than anybody as members of the NDCC to see what this has done to our businesses and what it's done economically. It's really, it's still, I think, critical for us to have the perspective of what we've been through and try to allow this major challenge to come through in everything that we do in the legislature. I'm committed to trying to do that. We may not have a single signature issue yet, but we certainly have a huge challenge in trying to prepare our state to recover fully and get back on our feet. And I think that has to pervade everything else we do. I myself, thanks for asking, Jeff. We're doing well. My family and I are both doing well. I do want to just mention, I just saw the news earlier today about the passing of Congressman Ron Wright. And I'm saddened to have lost Congressman Wright, who was diagnosed with COVID a couple of weeks ago, and he will be missed. And again, this is just a reminder of the difficult time we are in.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, for those who hadn't seen, Congressman Wright, who represented Central Texas, passed away earlier today due to COVID. So, John, you referenced the 86th session and the signature item being HB3, which many people on this call, others in education and business, came together to pass transformative school finance reform, which you supported and which the chamber and others supported. With COVID impacting revenue opportunities, do you see school finance reform funding being in any danger this session?
Well, it's a great question. The good news is in the base budgets that are out from both the House and the Senate, we basically see sustained funding at the same levels for K-12 education that we committed to in House Bill 3. And I think that is something that maybe, we wouldn't have thought we would see if you go back in time, maybe 6 months from where we are today. But fortunately, the budget situation has improved somewhat, and we've certainly gotten quite a bit of federal help to not only recover from COVID, but also to help with our schools and help with our local governments and essentially patch some holes in our budget. And that's been important. And so I'm optimistic, actually, about sustaining our funding for K-12 education. Now, if you make that question a little bit broader and say, well, what is the pandemic doing to education right now? Well, then you're obviously confronting the very, the major issue of learning loss, the major questions of what having to go to school remotely and under these circumstances has done to kids in terms of mental health and their engagement with their peers and their teachers and their community. So many of us see that, in our homes. If we have kids, we've had to navigate this situation. Those of you from the school districts, the school administrators and superintendents and leaders who are on the call and the trustees know all about that. And it's still an enormous challenge, even if we keep our funding at the same improved levels. One big question I think that also is presenting itself is what effect does all this have on standardized testing, on the STAR exam? Right now we are still going to be giving the STAR exam here in the coming months. And but there are many of my colleagues in the legislature that are pushing back against that and feel like we need to change in light of where we are in the pandemic. Those are big issues that I think will be debated this session. Fortunately, though, I think we're going to do it against a backdrop of sustained commitment to the funding levels we achieved last time under House Bill 3. Now, if you go beyond just K-12 education, look at higher education. And by the way, I just recently found out I'm on the Higher Education Committee. So those of you on this call who are connected to higher education, I look forward to learning more from you. It's an area I want to study up on and try to be prepared to contribute as a member of that committee. So, the picture is a little bit different there. The essential situation, as maybe some of you on the call would like to correct me or offer a different view, but we're kind of treading water there in higher education with the proposed base budgets, and we're maintaining levels. We're not facing cuts as severe as might have been feared earlier, but we're also not in a position like we are for K-12 education, where we made major improvements last session, and now we're building on that or sustaining that. Higher education hasn't been funded at quite the same level, robust levels that I think we've seen for K-12. And, the current budget doesn't improve the situation, but it doesn't make it a whole lot worse either. We'll have to, of course, debate that issue as the budget goes through the session and see what adjustments are going to be made. But that's obviously an important area for economic recovery for our state, as well as long-term economic prosperity. And so that's an area I think will be worth watching this session.
Let's talk about budget a little bit more. At our last legislative series program, we heard from Comptroller Glenn Hagar, and his revenue forecast was more positive than many of us had anticipated. What's your outlook on the forecast, the budget, and additional revenue opportunities?
Well, and I enjoyed that session with the Comptroller as well. That was really informative for me to listen to his perspective. And as you all saw, if you were on that program, yes, when he came out with his biennial revenue estimate at the very beginning of the session, it painted a better picture than many had feared. Still not a rosy scenario by any means. Compared to last session, last session we were coming into the legislative session with about a $5 billion budget surplus that gave us a cushion right away. We don't have that surplus this time. At least if it's turned into a surplus, I'm not advised. It's basically neither a deficit nor a surplus, very close to just running even as we come into the session. But as we look forward into the next budget cycle, we're facing greater constraints due to biennial revenue estimate that was affected by COVID and by the recession. Right now, what we have is a base budget that has come out in both the House and the Senate that currently proposes spending more than the Comptroller has estimated in the biennial revenue estimate, I think by roughly $7 billion of general revenue funds. So, if we're going to keep the budget at the level that has already been proposed, we have to find another $7 billion or more. And frankly, if you look at the previous session, what happened between the time of the base budget and the eventual budget as finally passed was an increase in spending of several $billion. And I think that's, maybe the more typical path is that you begin with a more conservative base budget. And as we evaluate the important priorities of the state, we actually are willing to, add spending to the budget. I don't know if that's going to happen this session or not. It's a hard one to predict because we are already in a position of having, a general revenue budget that spends in the base budget more than the Comptroller's pay-as-you-go estimate. Now, we can find ways, I believe, to close that gap. And three of them, I'll just mention. One are the possibility of federal help. Right now in Congress, we are debating the next stimulus bill. I think when I last checked, there's still a very significant amount of money that's being proposed as aid to state and local governments. And that certainly could make a big difference if the amounts stay at the levels they are. In fact, frankly, it'll be interesting to see what the timing of all that is. If Congress passes a budget that provides significant aid to states in the middle of Texas's budgeting process, that may involve the need to adjust pretty quickly to what has just happened in Congress. Another possibility certainly is the rainy day fund. The current base budget does not propose using any of the rainy day fund. That's something I would certainly be open to. I feel like this fund was built for days like we're facing right now, and I would be open to spending some of those funds. And there are always the possibility, if necessary, of looking at other options related to how we calendar our major budget payments, or rather major payments from the state treasury, such as to the Foundation School Program or to Medicaid. In the past, budgets have been effectively balanced by adjusting those dates at the end of the session and deferring payments into the next session. I don't know if that type of thing will be necessary or not, but at least in a pinch, it's an option if it's preferable to avoiding harmful cuts. So that's a big picture summary of where I see the budget. I mean, there are a lot of individual items we could talk about. There are areas where I feel like the base budget needs to be improved, but big picture, it's not as bad as we feared it might be. And I think we see solutions here to generate at least a budget that isn't a harmful one to our state.
Representative Turner, let's get into some revenue opportunities as well that might help with that budget challenge. One of them is tied in with one of our chamber priority initiatives for this session, which is reducing the number of uninsured Texans, one solution of which is Medicaid expansion, which you alluded to before. State Senator Nathan Johnson, who we'll hear from in 2 weeks, has been advocating for both the public health and the economic imperative for expansion of Medicaid. Where do you stand on this issue, and what are your thoughts on what the House may do with this if it gets to you?
Well, I always want to compliment Senator Johnson for his advocacy on this. He's really made it a centerpiece issue, and I think that was important. It's really has contributed to this discussion. I'm also pro Medicaid expansion, accepting those federal funds that are available to us under the ACA. It's the single largest step we could take to reduce immediately the number, or relatively immediately, the number of uninsured Texans, which is a major problem for our state. And I think the business case for it is very solid, and we ought to be receiving the tax revenues that we send to the federal government back in a fair proportion. And without accepting that expansion, we're really not doing so. And so I think there's a real case, a business case, a conservative case that can be made for Medicaid expansion, and I've favored it for a long time. And certainly the 90-10 match is just a good deal. I know many on this call are familiar with Texas 2036, the new organization that's been formed to help our state really be prepared for its long-term challenges that Tom Luce is involved in, and my former Secretary of Education, Margaret Spellings. I saw on their website the other day, they had a summary of this issue that really, in my mind, spoke to the fact that the 90-10 federal to state match is just the best deal you can find for the state with respect to health spending in the general area of Medicaid and other similar health services our state provides. And if you did accept that expansion, you could also reduce certain other state spending in primarily in the health and human services area of our budget that we currently use effectively to make up for the fact that we have not expanded Medicaid. And so I'm for it. Now, the question, though, is what are the prospects? And I guess I have to say, this is just me. My sense right at the moment is that there has been a loss of momentum to some degree on this issue. Not that we were ever clear that Medicaid expansion was going to pass in Texas, far from it. But I did hold out some hope, maybe before the session, as we were heading toward the session last year, that there could be sufficient interest in both the House and the Senate. And I saw a few members in both chambers who had not supported it in the past kind of make some noises to the effect of maybe they would. I do know, there is at least one Republican member of the Texas House right now, Representative Lyle Larson of San Antonio, who's come out publicly for it. He's a respected member of the House, someone who I think is certainly is conservative, but understands, again, this conservative case that can be made for Medicaid expansion. And I have to assume there are others, thinking about it and looking closely at it. And maybe there are others that have come out for it. Thus far, it's really been primarily an issue that's divided by party. I think every Democrat in the Texas House last session did support a budget amendment that would have effectively directed the state to accept Medicaid expansion. And I believe every Republican opposed it. So eventually we've got to get past, if we're going to make progress on this issue, what I view as progress, we're going to have to get past that partisan divide. I just don't know if the House is now ready to do that or not. Like I said, I haven't seen quite the push and quite the encouraging comments in recent weeks that I did before. I don't know how Speaker Phelan is approaching this issue. It's not something that's being built into any of the base budgets, certainly. And so we'll have to see. A session exists, at least in theory, to argue over these issues and to debate them. And I hope people will be open to the possibility. But I'm not sure if we're going to see that progress or not, Jeff.
Thanks very much. Let's talk a little bit about other revenue opportunities, which have been mentioned as potential for this session, which be legalization of gambling or sports betting, or even legalization of marijuana. Do you see any of those issues having any traction in the House? And if not, what are some other areas where we might come up with other revenue sources?
Well, the first answer to that, with respect to legalization of marijuana or sports gambling as revenue sources, the first answer is, I guess I don't know. I'm just one member of 150, and I don't know that I have a clear sense of where the rest of the chamber may be on it. I guess I would say count me as a bit of a skeptic on those, at least for the time being. And, I guess I personally, now I'm going to editorialize just a little bit. I don't believe either of those can be viewed as a long-term solution to budget problems, at least on any significant scale. Now, of course, years ago, we had the Texas lottery that was introduced. And I think to some, there was sort of a narrative that was built that was going to be an answer to funding certain major areas of state government, like education. It never really was intended to do that, but it acquired, a bit of a reputation for, being a solution of that kind, a major solution. And the numbers just never were sufficient to justify that belief. Without having studied all the numbers carefully, I tend to view those others that you mentioned, Jeff, in the same light. And I think we also have to be conscious of whether, for instance, legalization of sports gambling could change the character of our state in some ways that aren't as desirable. I'm keeping an open mind on issues of that nature, but I think there are a lot of Texans that sort of feel like, well, Texas can be Texas, and we can leave, Nevada to be Nevada, and allow differences to remain in the way we approach an issue like that. And so I think we need to proceed cautiously, frankly, is my view. With respect to marijuana legalization, that's something I really think we need to debate on its merits, and not so much with revenue foremost in mind. I mean, we really need to evaluate, is that a policy that is good for our state? And we can look at Canada and Colorado and other places that have gone that direction and decide how far we want to go in Texas. I personally think possession of small amounts of marijuana right now is over-criminalized in a way that is not good for our state and for our criminal justice system. And I did vote last session to reduce penalties for possession of small amounts of marijuana. But that's very different from full legalization of recreational use. And I tend to think we should just debate that issue mostly on its merits and not as a perceived answer to budget problems.
Thanks very much. And then the follow-up, if none of those materialize, which I'm skeptical as well that either of those, and maybe even Medicaid expansion could be a challenge. Are there other places where you see additional revenue opportunities during this session?
During this session, I would have to say, if you're talking about additional, meaningful additional revenue opportunities, which really, means you're having to look at possible additional taxes and fees, I think there's a very strong current against that, just because of everything people have already endured during the pandemic. And, when you have really almost any constituency you can think of has been affected negatively in the pandemic. And so if someone presents the idea of additional taxes or fees that would affect them, there's a good argument to be made that, well, this isn't the time. I mean, if you talk about, for instance, additional taxes on alcoholic beverages or something of that sort, well, they've been, the industry's been hit by the pandemic, the restaurant industry, the beverage industry, everybody has been really affected by the pandemic. I think, from what I hear, there's not an appetite right now for an increase in sales taxes or an increase in property taxes. I mean, these are all, there's a sense that this is just a tough time to look at those kinds of revenue options. Now, I think there could be some specific areas like, for instance, taxing e-cigarettes on the same basis we tax normal cigarettes. Yes, I agree. That makes some sense. If we're going to talk about longer term revenue solutions for our state, what I think is needed, first of all, is to feel like we're kind of back on our feet after the pandemic. And I think, really people like those of you on this call right here, people involved in the business community would need to be a major part of a discussion about the question of the revenue structure in this state. And I think it's very important if we're to talk about, ultimately the need to restructure our revenue, that it be something that is done on a bipartisan basis and that has some broad consensus within the population as a whole, and certainly including within the business community, which I think, having the support of the business community, such as is represented here today, would be important ultimately to any significant changes in our revenue structure as a state. I just don't see a high likelihood of that happening this session, especially when we do have the ability probably to access federal aid to help us get through this immediate crunch we've been in, and the possibility of also drawing down on the rainy day fund, which has a very healthy balance. I feel like that discussion is something that might happen a session or two into the future.
Thanks very much. I think, as many of you all know, our chamber's history has long been in transportation advocacy. Representative, what are some things that you're seeing on the transportation or transportation infrastructure front that may be prioritized for this particular session?
I think transportation is in a little bit of the same position that I described relating to higher ed a moment ago. I feel like this session we are treading water to some extent with respect to transportation projects. We're proceeding. We're continuing to evaluate, transportation investments, but it's not, at least based on anything I'm hearing right at the moment, it's not going to be an area that is receiving major boosts in funding compared to where we've been in the last several sessions. What I do think is, we need to look at some specific areas where we can improve transportation infrastructure. I'm really intrigued by the possibility of making some progress on electric vehicle infrastructure in Texas, which, if that industry is to take off, and by all indications we're headed that direction, but we need to be ready as a state to have the infrastructure for it, and to have charging stations in sections of the state where we don't right now, to help make sure that our infrastructure is ready. I think to draw attention to a local issue, something I'm looking at, and I'll just preview this as a possible bill that I'm looking into filing, the LIRAP funds that have been collected in the past when that program existed. And to remind everybody what I'm talking about here, these were previously funds collected from inspection fees that existed that were optional for counties to impose, but Dallas County and many of the other large urban counties in the state did have this program, and collected $6 per inspection, ultimately to be brought into a state account and then redistributed back to the different COGS, coalitions of government in the state, to be used for emissions reduction programs, clean air, clean transportation programs. But the program was ended a couple of sessions ago, but a lot of the money that was collected still remains in the account and is being used right now to certify the budget. I'm struggling to find any good reason why we need to just leave those tens of millions of dollars there. And I think there could be local transportation projects that could benefit, or that could help our region and could take advantage of those funds if we can find a way to distribute them back and allow our local COGS and counties to use them productively. So that's something I'm looking at on the transportation front.
Thanks very much. For those of you who are just joining us, we've got Representative John Turner here today. And if you have a question for Representative Turner, please go ahead and post it in the chat or send it to me privately, and we'll call on you to ask your question. Representative Turner, what are some of the less profile bills, which something you're tracking this session? You mentioned the LIRAP bill, but is there anything else that you've been tracking or that you filed so far that you want this group to be aware of?
Yes, well, I'll take the opportunity, Jeff, just to describe a few bills that I am. I'll give you a preview of a few bills that I'm working on, if that's all right. And by the way, I can drone on this for a long time. If anyone has a question, I'll be happy to stop and jump in and answer the questions. But in the meantime, let me just go through a few bills that I either have filed or am thinking of filing. And one bill that I have already filed is a bill about health literacy. This would follow a recommendation of our statewide health coordinating committee to establish a commission to promote health literacy in Texas, with a focus on areas like medical education, continuing medical education, involving employers in helping to disseminate health-related information to employees and to the population generally. And the rationale here is that health literacy, that is just knowledge of basic health facts, is critical. And we spend billions of dollars in health costs that are unnecessary and that could be saved if we had greater health literacy broadly in the population. This was actually the first bill that I had in the Texas House that passed through the House last session. Senator Johnson sponsored it in the Senate. Did not make it through the Senate, but he has also agreed to sponsor the same bill again, and I'm bringing it again in the House, and we are hopeful that maybe there's a chance of passing it this time. I don't think the need for good health literacy is any less now than it was 2 years ago, and in fact, what we're seeing in the pandemic with a lot of misinformation about COVID, misinformation about vaccines, to me illustrates that health literacy is equally urgent as a priority this time around. A few other bills that I'm looking at. I think mental health is it's always a critical state priority, but especially in light of what we've been through with the pandemic in the last year, especially mental health for teens and adolescents who have had to endure a very different environment, very different social environment, be separated from their teachers, their peers, be at home in many cases for long periods of time, or miss out on their normal activities that help engage them. You're seeing more and more statistics indicating greater mental health problems among teens and adolescents, especially, and also the population as a whole. But that's a priority area for me. I am looking at whether we can improve our treatment options that are available for teens and adolescents that have severe mental health problems. And one area I think we could improve is the quality of residential treatment options that are available to kids in these situations. Now, obviously the situation has to be pretty severe to warrant looking at residential, out-of-home treatment or hospital type treatment. But I do think, based on the research I've been doing and conversations I've been having, that is an important part of the continuum of care for teens and adolescents with severe mental health struggles. And frankly, we just need to make sure that the quality is high in our state of facilities that exist for this purpose. And that's something I am likely going to want to file some legislation on. I think to identify a couple of others, Jeff, one thing I actually have heard quite a bit from constituents about is street racing. I'm switching gears on you entirely. This is a local issue, of course, and the city has passed an ordinance on street racing. But they've also been telling me that they feel like they could use some help at the state level with some adjustments to our criminal code and other sections of the code that would give potentially prosecutors some additional tools to disincentivize this practice, which has really become a problem not only in Dallas, but really across the state. These organized sort of takeover events that are very hazardous, where unexpectedly to most people, they find that, one of their main thoroughfares has just been taken over by an organized street race. And, those things are obviously very dangerous and are a problem for the people that are encounter them. And I'll mention a couple of others, going back to the pandemic. Well, in the legislature, you tend to think, well, we ought to be able to do something about COVID response. And yes, we should. I think, we'll be considering many bills that relate in one way or another to COVID response, but at the same time that, the direct responsibility of administering the vaccine program is in the executive branch. It's in the, Department of State Health Services. It's, of course, in conjunction with local partners, with the county, with the city. And ultimately, the vaccine is being made available to the state through, the federal government. And so really, we in the legislature, I think, need to think critically about, well, what is our role here? In my opinion, we do have an oversight role with regard to what's happening in the vaccine distribution process. Now, that may not be passing a law, but it may be listening carefully to constituents who are concerned about the way something is happening, and trying to exercise the influence we can as advocates with the executive branch, with the department, with the panels that exist to govern vaccine allocation, and to make sure that we are providing some input as legislators and are, exercising a supervisory role over the vaccine rollout. And I think also we should be looking at what we can do to encourage vaccine uptake and to encourage those who are hesitant about the vaccine to, be willing to go forward and take it with a full understanding of the science behind it and the importance of making sure that we are getting high enough percentage of our population vaccinated to achieve herd immunity. So that's another area where I think I'm looking at introducing some possible legislation. And so those are a few. I could go on, but let me pause there to see if anybody has any initial questions. And if not, I'm glad to keep on talking about other areas.
Well, we do have a few audience questions, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to some of our attendees. And our first question is from our board member, Tony Sozeby from Hewitt-Zollars. And I understand that today is Tony's birthday. So happy birthday to Tony. And Tony, the floor is yours. Although you're on mute, Tony.
Okay, very good. What I was really wondering about is with the COVID response and the budget balancing that's going to be done, what about revenue losses and how it's impacted the energy sector and the increased expenses that are going on in managing and delivery of the COVID vaccines? And because this is going to go on for months and months and months from where we are right now, from all appearances. How is that being handled in the budget, and how is that being handled in discussions there?
Yes, well, the first thing I'll say about that is that, in my opinion, it's absolutely essential to make sure that we have, fully funded. We do not want to find, months from now that we are short on funds that we felt were needed to make sure that the vaccine distribution program is as robust as possible. Now, the federal government is providing a lot of funding to deal directly with that. And, much of that is going ultimately down to local governments that are administering, vaccine hubs, like the one we have here in Dallas at Fair Park. There's another federal hub that I understand will be opening likely in Dallas in the near future. And actually, what I don't know is, and maybe some on this call have more current information, but whether the hub is going to be basically also at Fair Park, if you will, that'll become a federally designated hub, or whether there will be another location. Yes, I think a lot of that is going to be, is going to work through federal funding with local implementation. Now, the state, I know, will be involved, and I know we're going to need to make sure that we have funds in our budget to, cover any role that the state needs to play. And, I certainly will do what I can to make sure that that is the case. But I think, for the most part, the federal stimulus packages are helping us accomplish, that distribution. I think also, the Biden-Harris administration has just announced their pharmacy program. That's something that I think we're going to see within, roughly a week or so, which is going to be a federally funded program to distribute vaccine through some of our major pharmacy chains. So all those things will be going. Tony, it's certainly going to be an important thing to execute on. We frankly have had a rockier rollout, I think, than people expected or hoped. I would say at this point in time, at least half of the calls that come into our office or inquiries relate to the vaccine. I know a lot of people are frustrated with the way it's gone. I hope over time some of these problems start to smooth out. I just want to make sure that in the end that, lack of funding is not one of them. And so whatever the state needs to do to stay on top of that, I'll do my part to help.
Thank you very much. I know that with the 3.5 million doses that Texas had received as of last week, only 2.6 million or so had actually gotten into somebody's arm. And it seemed like there was a disconnect between the distribution or the actual rollout locally to all the many different hub sites and other sites that are out there right now.
You're right. And I think we need to be watching and learning. Some states are frankly handling this rollout better than others. We just need to be watching what the successful states are doing. And if we can apply some lessons here, we should. One thing I'll just say that is a question I've been mulling over is, are we doing the right thing in Texas to continue to limit the distribution only to categories 1A and 1B? Now, granted, it's going to be a long time before we've got 1A and 1B fully vaccinated. On the other hand, a whole lot of states have gone beyond what we have in terms of the availability of the vaccine to essential workers, to teachers, to grocery workers, on the basis of their status as essential workers. My own view right now is that we would be well served by going ahead and expanding the population to cover those essential workers at a minimum. I think we've got to try to get ahead of these new strains that are starting to, predominate potentially and spread the virus again to, potentially very worrisome levels. We could see new surges if we don't move toward herd immunity at a faster rate than we are, currently. And so my view would be we should go ahead and expand availability of vaccine to those subsets. But I don't have more than just my say on that. That's obviously part of that's the decision making of the vaccine allocation panel at the state level. And all I can do is try to express my view about it.
Well, that was exactly what Dr. Fauci stated at the noontime lunch or news at lunchtime that I was listening to. So you're right on target with him.
Okay, well, then that I might be saying something sensible if he's saying that too.
Thanks, Tony, very much. Our next question is from our good friend down in San Antonio, Priscilla Camacho with the Alamo College District. Priscilla, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, and good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Representative Turner. Congratulations. We're excited to have you on the Higher Ed Committee. And so I'm going to ask this, and I see my friend Isaac, and I know Amanda, you probably are going to ask, maybe want to tag along with a four-year university-specific question. But in terms of funding, we're all pretty familiar with, we've seen this before in downturn economies, the easy target tends to be higher ed. And we've been fortunate to see flat level funding in SB 1, but there's some concerns with regards to the budget formulas for community colleges. And an added concern that was raised was some of the discussion in Senate Finance today. And this focus on the aid that some of the agencies and some of the institutions like us as institutions of higher ed received under CARES and the latest COVID relief package, which really was just emergency aid for students and really trying to just get us through the pandemic. So I'd be curious to kind of get your thoughts. Where do you see funding for higher ed, specifically community colleges, and where do you fall in that? How and funding us, particularly as we kind of go through the next 2 years, and we'll see those upticks in enrollment in community colleges and the need for our programs.
Well, thanks, Priscilla, and good to see you, and I appreciate that question. And that is a great example, by the way, of those of you on this call being so well informed about these issues. And it's my challenge to try to keep up with you, to tell you the truth. And you mentioned you were watching some of the hearings today on Senate Bill 1 in the Senate Finance Committee. That's the first. That's kind of the kickoff hearing, you might say, for the budget as it will begin to move through the Senate. And of course, this year the budget's going to be entitled, Senate Bill 1. It will originate in the Senate, so to speak, this time. Since it did in the House last time, and we alternate. So it's a great question. What I've heard, of course, from many institutions of higher ed that I've talked to, or at least several, you were subject to and this wasn't community colleges, but other institutions were subject to the 5% cuts, requested cuts during the pandemic, but then received, roughly an equivalent amount back in federal aid through the CARES Act. And it kind of came out even to a degree. But the question is, what do we do next? In my opinion, and I cannot claim that this is a thoroughly researched opinion at this point in time. It's just an instinct or a hunch. Is that between what we're seeing from potential federal aid in the latest stimulus package under negotiation, between possible rainy day funds sort of strategically used in our budget, and the general economic situation as it appears right now, I feel like we ought to be able not only to maintain present levels of funding for higher education, but actually to go further and to try to make some progress. Now, that's just my view. And again, it's not the case that I've dissected every part of the budget and can give you a fully informed opinion about it right now. But I do think we need to understand that higher ed, of course, is critical to our long-term future, that we made substantial progress in K to 12 education last session. And I feel like higher ed in a way is due to be addressed, that we need to recognize that higher ed is equally a part of our economic future in Texas. Community colleges are at the center of that. I mean, critical to sustain progress we've started to make in those areas. And state funding is very important to those institutions. And so in my view, we ought to be willing to make that commitment, even if it does involve, making some tough political choices. And, that's my orientation, Priscilla, on that issue. What exactly can be achieved, I think we're going to have to see, and as you know well, this process happens principally through the Appropriations Committee in the House and the Finance Committee in the Senate. The Higher Ed Committee that I'm now on, I think will be able to evaluate some questions, possibly the question of, tuition revenue bonds for our universities in Texas. We did not pass a TRB bill last session, although it did make it through the House, did not make it through the Senate. I'd like to see if it's possible to get a TRB bill passed this session. I'd like to see if we can help with research funding for our universities in Texas. That's another area where I think we're overdue. Now, again, how much of this can we do politically? We'll just have to see. I would say, in my opinion, though, we should press forward. We should try to make progress.
Okay, next question we've got from Jeff Mullen with Celanese. Jeff, you've got a question on redistricting. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah. Hey, Representative Turner. I just wanted to ask you about redistricting. What kind of the gives and takes you think are taking place over the next couple of months, and where do you think this is kind of headed, and what are your priorities in terms of influencing the process? And then the second question I had was just in terms of, other than what we talked about, are there other issues in terms of business investment, business climate, response to COVID, and protecting small businesses and helping small businesses that the legislature is currently looking at?
Yes, well, great questions, and thank you very much for that, Jeff. I'll start with redistricting. Redistricting is always a tough issue. I've not been through a redistricting session before, so I kind of have to go secondhand about what people have told me. And people have told me it's a rough process. Now, apparently, the situation right now is that we are likely looking at a special session in the fall on redistricting. And therefore, you're not going to have the same intense focus on it during the session in the regular session that you normally would. And the reason for this is the delay in receiving census data. Now, I'm sure, like almost everything to do with redistricting, there'll be a lot of arguments over this too, and over whether this is an appropriate subject for the special session in the fall. But going off what Speaker Dade Phelan said, I think to the Texas Tribune a few weeks ago, we may well be looking at a special session in September related to redistricting. Whole bunch of ifs in what I just said there, but let's just assume for the moment that what he said, pans out. At that point, then, things would really start to get focused and the negotiations really get going. Having not been through it before, I can't tell you too much more about what I really expect. I can tell you what I hope. What I hope is that members will take a principled approach to this, that they'll try to come up with districts that make sense and look like they make sense when you look at them on a map, and that will move away from severe gerrymandering and districts that snake through one community then another and really separate neighborhoods in an arbitrary sort of way. And at the congressional level, don't even try to respect kind of other political boundaries that exist, county and city boundaries and so forth. That's what I hope. Now, to be just real blunt about it, I mean, I'm a Democrat. I'm in the minority party. In the past, this has been a very partisan process. And in the last redistricting, the Democrats didn't have a whole lot to say about it in the big picture. My hope is, though, that we can try to improve on the process from last time. I know it's still going to be a very politicized process. My own preference would be that we have an independent commission that is appointed through a legislative mechanism that proposes these district lines so that you don't have the office holders themselves trying to choose their districts. But that doesn't appear, and it doesn't appear that's going to happen. And so we have to try to just hope for restraint, hope for principle and reasonableness in the process. Regarding small business, I am very much open to, by the way, to ideas from the NDCC and from all of you about how the legislature can best help small business. I do acknowledge, I think, some level of regulatory relief, similar to what we've seen in the pandemic. Some of those regulations that are cut back probably, could be made permanent. I think it's a matter of just deciding which ones make sense. I think there is going to be the issue debated in the session of liability protections related to COVID. In fact, Governor Abbott identified that as one of his 5 emergency items that he is presenting to the legislature. We know that issue is going to come up. I'm keeping, frankly, just an open mind on this question, and I'm going to want to look closely at, the actual bills that are filed on it to evaluate what I think about it, to evaluate what I, would support, what I think is problematic. I'm not one that is going to take probably an extreme view on either side of this issue. I know there is merit, frankly, in the positions of both those who strongly advocate for liability protections and those that think we, don't need any. The truth may be somewhere in between, and I just want to evaluate that issue as it comes up in the legislature.
Thanks very much, Representative. We are coming close to our time to conclude this program, but if folks have, and we've not been able to get to all the questions, but if folks have questions for you that they want to follow up with you or your staff, what's the best way for them to do that during the session?
Well, absolutely. You can, first of all, email us at any time. Our email is available on the House website to our district email. And I'll just, let me just make sure I give everybody my direct email as well that I receive through the state. And that is john.turner@house.texas, spelled out TEXAS.gov, G-O-V. Also, our district director, Brenda Allen, who I think many of you know, she is always accessible as well here in Dallas locally. And you can call her at the district office or you can email her. It's the same thing, brenda.allen@house.texas.gov. And we would definitely love to hear from you. Ideas for bills, your positions on these issues that we're debating. I welcome all of it. We do our best to, respond quickly, and especially if you have a substantive idea or proposal, it may be something that we would have to evaluate, pretty soon if we were to do anything about it or move forward with it in the session. So please don't hesitate to reach out and talk to us about it. And if you had a question you didn't get to ask today, I'd welcome your emailing it to us, and we'll get right back to you.
I can tell you all, as a constituent residing in 114, John and Brenda are very accessible and always willing to hear my ideas, and appreciate both of you, what you all are doing. I want to defer the last question to Ken Malcolmson, and Ken has got a question about the new speaker. So Ken, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, John, speaking of Speaker Phelan, tell us what your first impressions of Speaker Phelan are, and then tell us what you expect to see in differences in processes and procedures as we go through the session relative to Speaker Bonin.
Yes, well, that's a really good question, Ken, and we're still figuring that out, in my opinion, because we've had such an unusual start to the session since we, are still figuring out how to operate in COVID. We have not been together nearly as much in Austin in the early days of the session as we usually do, as we did last session, and so I think to a certain degree, it's still, that question is still being answered. What I will say so far, I've seen in Speaker Phelan is, I appreciate how he is trying to allow the House to be member driven. He has said to people that, if you have issues you think are important and you are willing to do your homework and you're willing to work the membership and present the case for your bills, he wants that to be the way things work. And he didn't come out and announce, as Speaker Bonin did last session, a major priority for the session. Dennis Bonin said it's going to be school finance, and we're going to tackle that. He even put that on the little coffee cups that were in the House lounge. They said, school finance. It reminded everybody every day that was his priority. Speaker Phelan hasn't taken that approach yet. But I think in part, the circumstances are just different. We are trying to feel our way through how we need to respond as a legislature in the pandemic. And there is no single issue that is as obvious, perhaps a challenge for the legislature. So I appreciate that he is trying to allow this to be a member-driven process. I do think he's reached out to all segments of the House at this point in time. He respected the tradition of allowing both Democrats and Republicans to have committee chairmanships. It was clear early on that he was going to do that, and I'm glad that he abided by that kind of longstanding tradition in the House. And I'm hopeful that we can continue along those lines and try to have a productive session. Let's see, Ken, your last question out now. You'll have to tell me again the other piece of it.
You answered both of them, so thank you very much.
Well, thanks. Thank you.
Well, it's now 2:59 p.m. and we want to be sensitive to everybody's time. So Representative Turner, thank you so much for this. It's always enlightening to hear from a member of the legislature, especially during the session. And we know how busy things can be and how hectic they can be during the session. So we really appreciate you taking an hour of your time to speak to us on so many issues. And we're very thankful to have you representing us here in North Texas. So thank you again for doing this. As a token of our appreciation, we'll be making a donation in your name, in the name of all of our speakers, to the North Texas Food Bank. And everybody, please stay tuned for our next program in the legislative series, which will be 2 weeks from today on Monday, February 22nd at 2 p.m. with State Senator Nathan Johnson and DFW Hospital Council President and CEO Steve Love for a discussion on Medicaid expansion. I put a link to register for that in the chat, and we'd love to see you back for that. Thank you so much to all of our sponsors for this program: AECOM, Bradley, Frostbank, HDR, HNTB, Jacobs, Encore, Texas Health Resources, Children's Health, Reliant, and Pulcinelli. Thank you, Jessica and Sandy, for doing the welcome today. And thanks to all of you for being engaged and being a part of this process during the legislative series, and for your flexibility in appearing virtually as opposed to a regular day at the state. We're enjoying putting on this program. It may be here to stay for the next legislative session as well, and just glad you all could be a part of it. So with that, we will adjourn, but we will keep the line open for any networking if you'd like to stick around and network, and otherwise sign up, and we'll see you all on the 22nd for State Senator Nathan Johnson and Steve Love. Ken, anything else you want to add?
No, thank you, Representative Turner. Fantastic. Thank you for spending some time with us today. We know how valuable your time is during this challenging period of time, but great to see you, and thanks for being part of this.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ken and Jeff. And I enjoyed the opportunity, enjoyed the discussion. And by the way, I just now hit my gallery, so I'm actually now just seeing many people I hadn't even realized were on the call yet. And it's great to see many familiar faces and friends here. And so appreciate everybody who joined, and always happy to talk about these issues.
That's great. Thank you. And there were, John, I don't know if you had a chance to look into the chat, but there were lots of high compliments to you and your leadership and the service that you're providing right now. I just noted one from Dr. Stone, who was very complimentary of you.
Oh, well, thank you, Dr. Stone. And I have to say thank you. And I mean, Dr. Stone, and I don't know if Karen Clardy is still on, or others from our, oh yes, I see Karen there. I mean, what you guys have been doing this year is really unbelievable, is above and beyond. And it's just amazing to be able to continue to run our schools with the spirit that you have, and in the face of all the obstacles we've had this year. I can imagine every day you must just have 100 things come up that you have to figure out how to navigate around. But we want to be as much help as we can. And please, tell us if you have ideas, of course, based on what you're experiencing in the district for how the state can better assist. We're all ears. I know I am, at least, because this is tough. This is a tough challenge.
For sure. For sure. That's
Yeah,
great.
yeah, thank you so much to our RISD friends. I see several of you all here. It's a privilege to have you all join us, and thanks for your engagement too.
You know, I just saw, it looks like she just dropped off, but it would have been nice if we could have formally introduced Brenda Allen, but
Yes.
it looks like she just dropped off. So in any event, John already mentioned Brenda, but she's just a fantastic resource here in the community and a great representative of John's staff. So thank you.
I also saw a nice comment from Mayor Karen Hunt on this program. So thank you, Mayor, for your participation and your kind words. And there you are. But you're on mute, though.
Yeah. You know, speaking of Mayor Hunt, I was surprised she didn't ask a question about municipal autonomy.
Yes.
I was going to, but on the same token, I think I have already had that conversation. So I like to say, use the words, I guess, predictable budgeting and community censorship. So that, and I think I've said those words to Representative Turner before. So and this is only an hour. So I didn't want to.
Yes.
It's true. Thank you, Mayor. We managed to, get through this without talking really about local control. We do get into it a little bit, and obviously that's another big issue that will be debated. We did not talk about, that's actually, I guess you could say, one of the governor's emergency items takes a form of that as well, related to Austin and police funding. But, I'm just feeling like we have so many big issues that we're trying to tackle in Texas. I just hate for us to kind of continue to create issues related to adversarial relations between state and local government. We've just got to try to change that dynamic and work together.
And Mayor, go ahead, Mayor.
You opened up the door. So the thing that makes me leery about the whole punishing people for or cities for quote unquote defunding police is there are so many good reasons to reduce a budget that I don't think that there is a way for them to put all of those exceptions in a budget. And at some point, we do have to rely on the leadership that our people. And if you need a couple, I have probably 45.
Yeah, I'm to be clear, I'm a strong supporter of our police and first responders and recognize the importance of public safety. And it is the precise level of funding for any particular department that's part of a city function, has always for decades in Texas been the province of the city government and the city council. And I don't know what this legislation is going to look like. I don't think I've seen it. I don't
think anybody has.
So, it is going to be interesting. I mean, if a city decides that they have achieved great success in reducing crime and feel like, therefore, they are able to reduce somewhat the budget of a police department and save the taxpayers some money without harming public safety, I'm not sure that they should not have the ability at all to do it. As much as I, again, favor very strong funding for our police and for public safety. So, I mean, this is just one of those issues that I guess is going to be debated as we go. I got to always be clear. I in no way support the idea of defunding the police because the police are critical and law enforcement is a critical function. We just have to, make sure that we're doing things that substantively make sense and that aren't sort of, political theater in response to an important substantive issue.
Yes, I agree.
So, John, Jeff put it in the chat feature for everyone's benefit, but I think everyone knows that Mayor Hunt is the current chair of the Texas Municipal League. And Bennett Sandlin, the executive director, and one other representative from the TML, thanks to Karen, will be addressing us later on in this legislative series. So we'll have a whole hour to talk about the discussion around municipal autonomy or local control. So that should be a very interesting session.
That will be. I look forward to it as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so far, some of the other programs we've got scheduled, of course, are the Nathan Johnson and Steve Love session, the Texas Municipal League. We've just scheduled the Commissioner of Higher Education, Dr. Harrison Keller, and then we've got Texas Tribune editor Ross Ramsey scheduled as well. So we've got one or two more that we need to fill. If you all have ideas for speakers, we want to keep this a little bit fluid because we're not sure how the session will go. But if anybody's got thoughts on a speaker or a topic that you want to hear about that we may have overlooked, let me know. We're trying to get the governor as well. But if you've got ideas on anything, we'd love to hear them. That goes for you too, John.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for this whole series is really excellent. I'm just looking forward to hearing the speakers in the future as well. And again, it's just great to have people engaged in this way as we go through the session. Sorry we couldn't have an in-person day. Of course, that is always preferable, but it's very different around the Capitol right now. I don't know if anyone's still on the call who's based in Austin and has been around. Totally different in the halls of the Capitol right now. Just extremely quiet compared to what we've seen, in the past.
Yeah. Hey, John, one last question. I know you got to run, but is there anybody that we might want to target to speak to this group relative to redistricting?
I will think about that, Ken, and I'll let you know of any thoughts. I probably need to look back and remind myself who just was appointed to the redistricting committee in the House. And, the members of the committee are going to be directly involved, of course, sooner really than everybody else. But I will also, I have a few other thoughts too, if I can get back to you on that with some possibilities.
Yeah. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be a legislator.
Right.
But on the other hand, it would be great if it were a legislator. But no, if you have any ideas on that, that would really be helpful. Hey, Sid.
Yes, I read an interesting op-ed or piece from Jason Villalba on redistricting in Sunday's paper, and it was just good to hear it from his perspective. So that just triggered that thought when you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Sid. Good to see you. I read that article too. He had some interesting anecdotes.
Yeah.
He did. He did. Yeah, that was a nice piece yesterday, and Jason, as you all know, represented the same district that Representative Turner is representing today. So at one point, now it's been how many years ago now, John?
He was the rep right before John.
Yeah, so it's only 2.5 years ago, or two plus years ago.
In 2017 was 4 years.
Yeah, amazing. Anybody else have anything? John, I'm sorry. Why don't you? We've kept you way too long, so thank you again. We really
thank you again, John.
Okay,
it's great seeing you.